Hello everyone, welcome back to Easy Research Talks. On this channel, our aim is to simplify the complexity of research methodology, and today we will be discussing variables in academic research. We will do that by defining what exactly is variable, what is the role of variable in an academic research, and what are the types of variables, and how do we use variables to construct hypotheses. I remember variable was one of the concepts I found difficult in research methodology. And if you are like me, finding it difficult to understand the concept of variable, this is the video you want to watch. In that case, let's do it. What is the definition of variable? Variable is generally defined as any concept that can have two or more values which can be counted and measured. I would like to repeat that. Variable is any concept that can have two or more values and that can be counted and measured. There are two keywords here, counted and measured. So if a concept has only one value, it can be a variable. A good example is a car or an orange, one of them. A particular car, if you know a particular car, you can say Honda or Toyota. That is not a variable. But when we have different types of Toyota, there is Toyota Corolla, there is Toyota Camry, there is Highlander, this becomes variables because it has variations. Another example can be something that can be counted. In the case of Toyota, we can count it 1, 2, 3, 4. But what about concepts that can be counted? For example, you can say gender. Gender has different variation. Some can be male, some people can be female. Another example, we can say personality. If you ask some people about their personality, or if you try to understand people's personality, you might say introvert or extrovert. You can either rely on the attributes of an introvert or the characteristics of an introvert to understand if truly this person is an introvert or not. So I hope that definition is simple enough. Now let's move on to types of variables. But before we can understand types of variables, we really have to understand why do researchers use variables? What do they use it for? One thing they use it for is to understand relationship. If you understand in one of our previous videos, we explain different purposes of research. And some of the purpose we counted was correlational purpose, a study that tends to explain relationships between two or more phenomena. Now, in that case, you have two or more variables. It could be that one concept is causing the changes in another concept. So basically, researchers use variable to understand relationship. And now to know the role between who and what is causing the change in another concept is exactly the reason why we categorize variables into types. I'll give you an example. If you say smoking leads to cancer. Now, smoking in this instance is the one causing cancer, right? Smoking and cancer are both variables in my example, but one is playing the role of the influencer, while cancer is the influenced. That's a perfect example of types of variables, right? The influencer variable, the variable that caused the change in another variable, is known to be an independent variable. Sometimes we call it the predictor variable or the explanatory variable, whatever name you want to call it. The role of an independent variable is that it either influences the change in another variable, or it causes the change in another variable, or it affects the change in another variable. Whatever word you want to use, the variable that is causing the change is known to be an independent variable. Now, what about the variable that is being influenced? That is known to be dependent variable. Another name for it is outcome variable. Sometimes they call it criterion variable. The role of this variable is that it receives the influence of the independent variable. Going back to my example, when you smoke more, the possibility of having cancer might also increase, right? So cancer as a variable receive the influence of smoking. Let's use another example. If you have money, it's possible you live a good lifestyle, right? Or healthy lifestyle. So money could be independent variable, while your lifestyle is dependent variable because money influences it. You can use this concept in your day-to-day life, and you have to practice more before you can really get a hold of understanding independent and independent variable. But the best way to do it is to practice more. Try to approach your day-to-day life with the concept of what is causing what, okay? It helps to understand it. Another type of variables that we might also have is the mediating variable. Mediating variables are variables that explain the reason, or they explain the connection between the independent variable and the dependent variable. For this, I might use the example of the COVID-19 or lockdown. Okay, so we might say lockdown has an impact on economy, but it might not necessarily mean that lockdown influence economy directly, right? Because lockdown is a sickness on its own, or it's something that happened because of sickness, right? But economy is a result of business activity. So in this case, business activity explain the connection between lockdown and economy, right? So in this example, business activity is the mediating variable because it cannot be connected to economy without business activity. Now, I will explain simply the theory of mediation. In the theory of mediation, before you can really say in your study you want to use mediation, you have to ensure that there's a connection between the independent variable and the mediating variable. Also, there will be a logical connection between the mediating variable and the dependent variable. If we are not concerned about economy, lockdown can be connected to business activity because lockdown affects business activity. People can't go to work, right? So that's a connection there. And if you are not concerned about lockdown, business activity and economic development are also connected, isn't it? So we can say business activity and independent variable having influence on economic development. So when we bring the three of them together, we can see that business activity can also be the explanatory variable or the explanation of the reason behind the influence of lockdown on economic development. Another type of variable we also use in academic research is the moderating variable. So moderating variable influence the relationship between an independent variable and the dependent variable. I will repeat that. Moderating variable influence the relationship. So if a moderating variable is present in the connection between an independent and dependent, it might make the relationship to become better or make it become weaker. It doesn't mean that the relationship does not occur, but the introduction of a moderating variable would influence the relationship. Going back to the example of lockdown, business activity. So we can say internet connection is a moderating variable. So lockdown obviously affects business activity. But let's say somebody has internet connection, right? or digital technology, you run a digital business. So you are affected, but maybe not as someone that is not connected through the internet, isn't it? So then we can see that internet connection moderates moderates the connection between lockdown and business activity. Let's talk about types of relationship that we can use variables to study. Mainly, there are two types of relationships. There is causal relationship. The relationship between independent variable and dependent variable can be causal. When we say causal, another name for it is recursive relationship. And that means that the effect or influence can only come from independent variable to dependent variable. An example is smoking leads to cancer. I said smoking is an independent variable. So it can only influence cancer. You can have cancer because you are smoking. It can't go from dependent to independent, right? Because it can never happen that you are smoking because you have cancer. I mean, it's not logic. The second type of relationship that can happen between independent variable and dependent variable is the non-causal relationship. When we say non-causal relationship, it means that the framework or the relationship is non-recursive. That is, as independent variable is influencing the dependent variable can also influence the independent variable. Or we can say the relationship can happen at the same time. It doesn't mean that independent variable has to happen first before dependent can happen. A good example is when we say people like who they know more, right? So likeness is the independent variable. People like who they know more. Likeness is an independent variable. And knowing more about people might be a dependent variable. The more you know more about people, the more you like them, isn't it? Right? So independent variable. Also, it can also go the second way. You might like people because you know more about them, right? So that becomes a two-way influence. The dependent can influence the independent, or independent can influence the dependent. Or I should say, it does not necessarily mean that you have to know more about people before you like them. But you can like someone because you know more about him, or you know more about somebody you like. It can go the two-way round. I'll try to summarize that. There are two types of relationships. There's causal relationship. This happens when the influence is only coming from the independent variable to the dependent variable. And in that case, the independent variable must happen first, right? The example of lockdown and business activity. Lockdown happened, then business activity was affected, isn't it? That's a causal relationship, right? But in some other cases, it doesn't necessarily have to be that independent happened first before the dependent happened. So in that case, we say there's association, there's connection, not really an effect or an influence. Now let's move on to discussing hypotheses. Hypothesis is something that every academic researcher use or you meet in mostly quantitative research, studies that use relationship, that study relationship. And now, what is hypothesis? The simple way to put hypothesis is that hypotheses are empirical suggestions. So the simple way to put hypothesis is the prediction of a research findings. You're trying to suggest the possible findings of your study in a statement, in a simple statement. That's why sometimes hypotheses are defined as empirical suggestions. When a researcher is interested in determining the relationship between lockdown and business activity, right? So that researcher might develop an hypothesis that says there is a relationship between lockdown and business activities, or there is the lockdown has influence on business performance, right? So when I say statements like this, I am predicting the possibility of my findings. So hypotheses are statements or are suggestions that can be tested to be true or false. So the statement I made now, if I collect data and I observe the data, I analyze the data, I might find out that my hypothesis, my suggestion, it's not true. It doesn't mean that my research is not worth doing. Or I might find out that my hypothesis is actually true. So I have predicted my findings. And this helped me to keep focus. It helps my research to stay in focus, to know what exactly I'm looking for. Hypothesis is also used to get answers for your research question. So if you notice, if somebody is interested in determining the relationship between lockdown and business performance, it is most likely that the research question would be, what is the relationship between lockdown and business performance? So from these research questions, I would develop an hypothesis that says there is a relationship between lockdown and business performance in line with my research question. So as I test my hypothesis, I'm invariably trying to get answer to my research question. I hope you are able to connect the research question with hypothesis with that explanation. In fact, there are two types of hypotheses. There are hypotheses that we sometimes call two-directional hypothesis or non-directional hypothesis. As confusing as that might sound, they are the same thing. When an hypothesis is not concerned about the direction of the relationship, so we say it's either two-directional or non-directional. That is, the connection between lockdown and business performance can either be positive or negative. We are not sure. We don't know. So when I say there is a relationship between lockdown and business performance, that is an example of non-directional hypothesis because I am not concerned about the direction of the relationship, either positive or negative. Another hypothesis might say there is a negative relationship between lockdown and business performance. So when this kind of hypothesis specify the direction, I am looking for negative relationship. So when I'm looking for negative relationship, that's an example of the directional hypothesis. So two type of hypothesis, non-directional and directional hypothesis. And sometimes they call it two-tailed hypothesis or one-tailed hypothesis. Two-directional, non-directional, two-tailed hypothesis are all the same. So the second type is one-tailed or directional hypothesis. These two names also refers to one type of hypothesis, and you know it's directional when the hypothesis specify either positive or negative. I would like to add more to this that it is important to know what positive and negative means. When we say positive, that actually means that the changes that occur in the independent variable or an increase in the independent variable will cause an increase on the dependent variable. So the more independent variable, it's possible that the changes in the dependent variable will increase. Logically, what I mean is the more lockdown, the more influence we will have on business performance, right? So that's a positive relationship because the changes between independent and dependent move in the same direction, right? But when it's negative, the changes moves in alternate direction. So when we say there's a negative relationship, what we are saying is that more lockdown, less business performance. That means business will not succeed in during lockdown, right? Because probably they are not able to work, right? People are not able to go to market. They are not able to engage in business activities. So more lockdown, less business performance. So the relationship is alternate. The direction of the relationship is alternate. So when the direction of the relationship is alternate, we look for negative relationship. All right, let me quickly summarize what we have been talking about. We started by defining variable, and we said variable is any concept that has two or more values and can be counted or measured. And we also talk about types of variables. We said we have independent variable, which is also known as the explanatory variable or the influencer variable. We also have dependent variable, that is the influenced variable or the outcome variable, the variable that receive the influence of the independent variable. Another type of variable is mediating variable. That is the variable that stands in between the independent variable and the dependent variable. And the fourth type of variable that we also talk about is the moderating. Moderatings are variables that explain the relationship between independent and dependent, or that influence the relationship between independent and dependent. Then we move on to discuss type of relationship. We said there are two types of relationship: causal relationship, that is the independent variable happened first, then the dependent variable will occur or will receive the influence. And the second type of relationship is non-causal relationship. That is, both independent and dependent can happen at the same time. And finally, we ended with hypothesis. What is hypothesis? Hypotheses are empirical suggestions or statements that can be tested true or false, not confirmed statement. Types of hypotheses are two-directional or non-directional. Two-directional are hypotheses that do not specify the directions of the relationship, while directional specify either negative or positive. And there is it. If you like what you have watched, kindly subscribe to this page, like, also leave a comment. You can also like our Facebook page at Easy Research Talks, and also comment on this video should in case you have any input. Thank you for watching, and see you in our next video. Bye bye.